You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise in Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and let's start today with a two-part story out of California. The first part happened in 1990 and ended in the death of 4 men. The second part happened in November and ended in the death of a beautiful and loyal wife. So let's talk about David Brinson. Back in 1990, David was 23 years old and living in the Mid-Wilshire district in California. So that's basically central LA. David had been tracking a retired neighbor and his ongoing steady stream of visitors. That neighbor, 59-year-old Robert Marks, had mostly been a quiet staple of the neighborhood. But when he started receiving more visitors, David wrongly surmised that Robert must be a drug dealer. In his young mind, he couldn't think of another reason why the visitors would be just potentially showing up to Robert's house. On a June evening in 1990, when Robert had 3 visitors at his home, David pushed his way into Robert's apartment. He's thinking, if Robert is a high-level cocaine dealer, then me and my 2 baddie buddies here, well, we'll take our guns and we'll go in there and we'll score us some drugs and some money. After the 3 ransacked the entire apartment, and they only found a small amount of marijuana, David kind of lost his marbles. He lined Robert and his 3 friends up in Robert's bedroom, forcing them to lie shoulder to shoulder on their tummies on the floor. He then stepped over the men and shot each of them in the back of the head. All 4 died from their wounds. The other 3 victims were Robert's roommate, 28-year-old Gene McCullers, and Gene's friends, 33-year-old Celedinio Lica and 27-year-old William Terry. And those friends weren't there to buy drugs. They were all just enjoying a basketball game on the TV. After murdering the 4 men, David and his 2 cohorts fled the apartment. A short time later, another friend arrived at the apartment to also watch the basketball game. Instead, he was met with the nightmare of finding his friends murdered, execution style. 3.5 years later, after some strong detective work, David faced a jury and 4 charges of capital murder. Remember, it's 1990 and California, like today, has the death penalty, except back then, California was actually executing prisoners sentenced to death. Since 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom has stopped all executions by issuing a moratorium. The last execution in California took place back in 2006. But in 1994, it was a real threat, and David was facing the death penalty. The jury did find him guilty of the 4 murders, and it was unanimous. But when it came to sentencing him to death, they couldn't come to an agreement. When the sentencing portion of the trial played out, the state did not want to retry anything. They had their conviction, and it wasn't worth jeopardizing that to get a death penalty for a sentence. So after some negotiations, David agreed to not appeal his conviction, and for that, he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole instead of facing the death chamber. Now, Superior Court Judge George Trammell agreed to the negotiations, and David went away for life at the age of 27. That's the first half of the story. Now we have to fast forward to November of last year. That's when 62-year-old Stephanie Dowles visited her husband David at the Mule Creek State Prison, which is about an hour's drive southeast of Sacramento. David had been behaving in prison, and due to his good behavior, he had been granted conjugal visits with Stephanie. A while back, I listened to a podcast about how these visits work. Okay, well, first, the podcast wasn't specifically about the visits. It was actually about a loved one and how they make the visits work and all of the relationship with, being married to somebody who's in prison. Now, some of these conjugal visits are about having intimate relations, but not all of them. In the podcast, the family member talked about how they would use the visits to sometimes have family time that seems more normal, like play games together or cook a meal for family dinner time or look at photo albums together and reminisce. And some of these conjugal visits can last up to 40 hours. Now, this visit between Stephanie and David was just the two of them in an isolated area. And in some prisons, that's a modular building next to the prison. Sometimes it's actually in the prison in a different wing. At this prison at Mule Creek, the area where Stephanie and David were is like a modular home. It's apartment-like, private, but it is on the prison grounds. The individual apartment also has a phone so that those on the visit can communicate with prison guards. And the prison guards are supposed to pop into the modular home about 4 times in a 24-hour cycle. Now, I couldn't find in the source material exactly when David and Stephanie married, but Stephanie has children and grandchildren, and her son does not have the last name Brinson. So Stephanie had a previous life. But somehow, her and David's paths crossed clear back in the early 2000s, and she ended up married to him while he was incarcerated for life with no chance at appeal. On that November day in 2024, Stephanie was staying overnight for the visit. In the early morning hours, at about 2 o'clock, David used that phone to call the guards. He let them know Stephanie was having some kind of medical episode. She had passed out, according to his words. When prison officers entered the apartment on prison grounds, they attempted life-saving efforts unsuccessfully, and Stephanie was pronounced dead an hour later. Well, this week, authorities announced that they believe Stephanie died at the hands of David. He allegedly strangled her to death. Suspicions about David's retelling of the evening led investigators to dig deeper into Stephanie's death. Her son, Armand Torres, said David's story and retelling of those events surrounding her death, well, they just kept changing. And it was easy things to keep straight, like where David found her unconscious body. At first, he said he found her on the floor. Then he said he found her in the bed. Well, Stephanie's children said a lot of the visits included Bible study and her efforts to help David get on the right track. Initially, they said they were weary of Stephanie visiting David, but eventually Stephanie convinced her son to allow her to take her grandson to see David on one of these visits. That led to Stephanie's grandson calling David Grandpa. Her son Armand said that seemed like a green light to him. If he could trust his son with David, then his mother must be okay. Armand did say he never asked why David was in prison, and he was completely unaware that he had been convicted for killing 4 men. Armand said he believes in second chances and that his mom would talk with David on the phone nearly every day. Now, he did say that those phone calls weren't always pleasant. Sometimes they argued about Stephanie pushing David to be a better person, but Armand chalked that up to the fact that couples fight sometimes. Now, Stephanie, whose loved ones called her Stevie D, worked as a hairstylist in the Los Angeles area. The murder has had a significant impact on her family since Stephanie was the primary care provider for her aging parents. She also provided financial support for her 2 sons and her 8 grandchildren. This woman sounds like a saint, and her pictures are frankly pretty angelic. She's beautiful and bright, and what I mean by that is she just seems to have a light to her. Her sons described her as a faithful woman of God who had dedicated her life to uplifting others through her unwavering faith, boundless optimism, and the deep connections she fostered. Now, Stephanie's story is heartbreaking, like many of the stories I bring you here. But I am sad to report that this isn't the only time in recent months that a woman has died while visiting a family member at prison in California. Back in July, 47-year-old Tanya Thomas was visiting her domestic partner, 48-year-old Anthony Curry. Now, Anthony is serving a life sentence for attempted second-degree murder with an enhancement of intentionally discharging a firearm and causing great bodily injury. His life sentence for that crime has an added sentence of 13 years for a different crime, for carjacking while using a firearm. So let me tell you the details of the crime pretty quickly here. Back in 1999, Anthony shot his girlfriend, Senada Browning. Senada was found barely alive in a remote truck stop. She had suffered a single gunshot wound to the left temple. The bullet had exited out her right eye, which was completely destroyed. Anthony was caught when his father started putting two and two together. Anthony had Sineada's car and her cell phone, but Sineada hadn't been around for a bit. Scared his father was possibly going to turn him in, or scared that someone else had figured it out like his dad had, Anthony dumped Sineada's car and carjacked a silver Mercedes-Benz at gunpoint. Stupidly, he didn't dump Sineada's car and get away from the car before carjacking another car. No, her car was right there where he committed the second crime. Now, several days later, he tried to carjack a Suburban, but the driver of the SUV floored the gas and just took off. That driver was able to pick Anthony out of a lineup. Later on that day, a lengthy and dangerous police chase led to Anthony being apprehended. So, back to Tanya, Anthony's now dead domestic partner. Tanya was allegedly strangled by Anthony when she was participating in a conjugal visit in July. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation says the visits are meant to foster a supportive family relationship. They say the application process is lengthy and only the most well-behaved are granted visits. Death row inmates and prisoners convicted of sexual offenses are not allowed the privilege. Stephanie's son said he wants these men to take accountability for what they have done because he doesn't see a current deterrent. He said the following: "What's stopping the next person from killing their wife or son or anybody?" Now, charges have yet to be filed against David, but he's not going anywhere, so authorities say they are securing their evidence and their case before they take the next step. Let me know what you think about this story. Now to a breaking story out of Arizona. On Saturday, 51-year-old James Arthur Eves was gunned down in his quiet Arcadia neighborhood on his very own driveway. James, who actually goes by Artie, well, that's a shortened version of his middle name, and that's what I'm going to call him in this story. He was a well-respected defense attorney. He represented doctors, the city of Phoenix, and the greater Maricopa County. He worked his way up to partner at Sanders & Park Law Firm. This guy is on the correct career path if you're a lawyer. Well, on Saturday morning, a neighbor of Artie's heard 5 distinct gunshots. They then saw a white BMW leave the area. The quick-thinking neighbor recorded the license plate number and then called 911. When authorities arrived, they found 5 shell casings in the driveway of the home and also some damage to the garage door, most likely from the bullets. Authorities also quickly gathered security footage from Artie's home. In that video, the white BMW arrives at the residence and a man wearing a hooded sweatshirt exits the car holding a firearm. While investigators continued to process the scene, Artie's parents and his brother Christopher arrived at Artie's home in a very distinct car, a white BMW. During that encounter, authorities detained Christopher and they searched Artie's parents' car. In the back seat, they found a sweatshirt that matched the sweatshirt worn by the driver of the white BMW. Investigators asked Artie's parents if their son Christopher had used the car. They readily admitted he had borrowed the BMW that very morning and then returned just about the same time that the parents were made aware that there was some sort of disappearance happening at their son Artie's home. When police eventually searched Christopher and Artie's parents' home, because they lived together, they said they found a firearm on the nightstand in Christopher's bedroom. Christopher was arrested and charged with murder. He is currently being housed in the Maricopa County Jail with a $1.5 million cash-only bond. During his initial appearance in front of the judge, Christopher already made an objection to the judge, saying he was not properly read his Miranda rights during the investigation. You guys, this one's going to be a doozy. Authorities have yet to say why Christopher allegedly shot and murdered his brother. Now, on a local to Arizona note, a prominent Arizona radio DJ was interviewed by local TV affiliate 12 News because he lives in Artie's neighborhood. John Jay of the John Jay and Rich show said he couldn't believe that his quiet neighborhood would have that sort of violence. Now, I couldn't find anything about him knowing Artie, but I do understand that Artie has a wife and 3 children. Christopher is due back in court today. I will be watching this one, and I'll keep you updated. Now to a story out of Mississippi where a supposed God-fearing couple have been arrested for embezzlement. Who is this couple? Well, Brian Dickens is the head pastor for the Centerville Baptist Church in Covington County, Mississippi. He has served at the church since 2007, but not always as the head pastor. He worked his way up to that position. Prior, he was a worship leader and the associate pastor. Brian is married to his wife, Bettina, and the two have 4 children. Now, according to the church's website, Brian loves teaching the Word of God in a practical, down-to-earth way that allows his congregants to apply the teachings in their everyday lives. The bio on the website goes on to say that Brian strives to be a pastor that is filled with the Spirit, one that is authentic and also approachable. The description closes with the idea that Brian believes in a very simple and biblical approach to the ministry. Love God, love people, lift up Jesus. Well, it must have come as quite a shock to his followers when he and his wife were arrested and jailed earlier this month. According to the arrest warrant, on March 3rd, representatives from Citizens Bank contacted investigators at the Covington County Sheriff's Office. They had concerns about Brian misusing borrowed funds. Here's how all of that played out. Brian owns Quality Auto of Collins, a used car dealership. Brian has a floor plan with Citizens Bank. What that means is they provide him money to purchase cars to sell on the lot, and he is supposed to pay them when a car is sold, as well as cover interest while the cars sit on the lot. Citizens Bank told investigators that Quality Auto had approximately 41 automobiles floored with Citizens Bank, meaning they were covering the cost of those 41 cars and trucks. Citizens Bank was informed that Quality Auto was closing their doors. It seems that Brian made a Facebook post on January 8th that he would be shuttering the business after more than a decade of operation. On the post is a picture of the car dealership and the building with a completely empty lot. Of course, bank representatives went to Quality Auto to figure out what was up with the 41 cars and trucks. Brian was there at Quality Auto when they arrived, but there were no cars on the lot. The representatives, who Brian had met outside, were clearly concerned. They told Brian they were there to, pick up the floored automobiles, take care of their business. That's when Brian told the representatives that there were no cars to pick up, and he went inside, locking the doors and refusing to speak to bank representatives any further. Now, the representatives left, and they started digging to find the cars, checking auction houses, calling other dealerships. They were able to locate some of the vehicles at 2 different auction houses in Mississippi. When they talked with the auction houses, the representatives realized that some of the money that Brian said he was using to purchase the cars to place on his lot had not been used to pay the auction houses for the cars that he had, quote unquote, bought. Citizens Bank representatives were only able to locate 11 cars. 30 of the cars and trucks are still missing. So, Citizens Bank called the cops. And with their investigation, they determined that Pastor Brian Dickens willfully, unlawfully, feloniously, and fraudulently appropriated nearly $1,172,000. News of the arrest and alleged embezzlement was announced a week ago. Brian has been charged with 1 count of embezzlement, and Bettina has been charged with felony false pretense. So basically, she signed documents knowing that her and Brian allegedly intended to defraud Citizens Bank. Now, Brian's bond has been set at $100,000, and Bettina's bond has been set at $25,000. Searching through Brian's and Bettina's Facebook profiles, I noticed a couple of things. When they announced the closing of the business, almost 300 people made comments showering them with best wishes and prayers and love and "you guys have got this" type posts. They do seem beloved in this community. The church website also still has their profile up. We have already mentioned second chances in today's podcast. Maybe Brian and Bettina are surrounded by loving people who are willing to offer a second chance. Tell me what you think of this story in the comments. Now to Houston, Texas, where 3 teenage girls, ages 14, 15, and 16, are facing aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. And it's all because of Wi-Fi. The violent mischief happened on Sunday when the 3 sisters lost their minds when their mother turned the Wi-Fi off in the house. In retaliation, the girls grabbed kitchen knives and chased their mother around the house, knocking down their grandmother when she tried to intervene. The mother then fled the home and the girls chased after her. One of the girls bashed the mother with a brick that they picked up off the ground. Police were called and the 3 girls were taken to the Harris County Juvenile Center. Police said neither woman was seriously injured during the incident. According to KRIV, that's a local Fox affiliate, they spoke with a neighbor who said the girls have regular run-ins with the law and that having cops at the house is common. Almost makes me feel bad for the fellow inmates at the Harris County Juvie. And let's finish today on a bit of a lighter note. Florida. That state is always good for some crime that's outrageous. Now we have to go back to February of last year for the actual crime. It seems police believe that 44-year-old Allison Fetting walked into a Coconut Creek Dairy Queen wielding a gun. She walked up to an employee, showed him the gun, and demanded money. The employee just stepped back, and Allison went to work trying to open the cash register. When she wasn't successful, she settled for robbing the tip jar of about $1.50 before she fled the store. This crime, which really wasn't much of a crime except for the waving around of the gun part, it just kind of sat there for the last year. Then Miss Allison got herself arrested for other crimes like armed robbery and drug possession in Palm Beach County. Those crimes landed her in the state prison. And this week, Broward County officials filed charges against Allison for the Dairy Queen theft. She is expected to be charged with armed robbery. This seems to kind of be a thing for Allison. Back in the early 2000s, Allison served 3 years in prison for aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, battery on law enforcement officers, and grand theft. Now, Allison's going to be transferred back to prison after her arraignment on the Dairy Queen $1.50 charge this week. I guess when you're desperate, $1.50 is what you take. And now to the comments from Monday's episode. First, Kelly mentioned that soldiers need better options for mental health care. This after she listened to the Kentucky soldier who gunned down his wife when he snapped following a fight at his wife's birthday party. Now, in the episode, I didn't really mention that it's difficult for active military to ask for mental health because it might harm their rise in the ranks. I have also heard it might alter where active soldiers get stationed. I think in some of these cases, with anger and an unaddressed emotion in a soldier, that active soldier might want to seek help, but they're worried about their careers. And then Becky said her heart broke that the kids were so close to the violence that was enacted on their mother. Okay, Mooncat on YouTube, she said she feels Matt Weiss, that's the football coach who collected all the data on the athletes across the nation. Well, she said his behavior mirrors a psychopath. And Chris on Spotify had an interesting take on the twins who were found dead atop the mountain, and then the firefighter leaked the photo. Chris said they saw the photo. Like, Chris actually saw it. And in their opinion, it looked like murder, not like murder-suicide. Chris theorized maybe the firefighter leaked the photo to potentially force an investigation. You guys, it's worth asking that question. I will admit that I covered that story because it seemed a little wonky. So maybe that's a potential, Chris. And finally, to the pressing question from last week's episode, almost everyone calls it doing donuts. Katie, Raven, Lacey, Mrs. Hughes, Alexa, Abby, and others. Okay, Mez and Kat, both from Australia, call it donuts, and even listeners from Canada call it donuts. Not a single person said they call it laying drag. That didn't come from any listener, despite the stories saying that's what they call it in Georgia. Now, Adrian in Oklahoma said, in Oklahoma, it's donuts if you spin them in an open parking lot, but it's cookies if you go from one side of the road to the other. So with this debate, I'm calling it donuts it is. But I have another one. Do we solve the name of the compartment in your car that's located in the dash? Is it a jockey box, a glove compartment, a cubby, a glove locker, a glove box, a dash box? Let me know what you call it wherever you're at listening to this podcast. All right, that's your Thursday episode of Rise and Crime. Thank you for the case suggestions. I am researching a case from a loyal listener. I will be bringing you that on Monday. Like I've always said, I want to talk about what you want to talk about. And please share this episode with a friend, especially one that you know is interested in true crime. We'd love to have Oh No Media grow. We obviously love 5-star reviews and positive comments here. Please like and follow us on all of our social media and YouTube accounts that we have at Oh No Media. That's Murder with My Husband, Into the Dark, and Rise in Crime. You can join me again on Monday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.